Another thing is that in the 60s, my mom and dad were in a bar together in West Philadelphia on like a date night. And the phone rang, and the bartender said, "Hey, Heinz, it's for you." Who knows me here? On the phone, it was a local, well-known businessman, strongly suggesting to my dad that he and my mom leave that bar and go check out a restaurant down the street. Shortly after they left, there was a shooting in that bar, which was widely believed to have been a mob hit. So, my dad might have known a guy. The thing is that he knew lots of guys, right? He knew the senators and the judges and the firefighters, but he also knew the guys who were down on their luck and who maybe kind of lived in that black and white, gray space, good and bad. He also really could not resist a hard luck story. My dad's financial records, which really were like these little notebooks that he would just handwrite his financials in, were littered with these small business loans, like micro loans. He was like $5 to Dolan, $15 to Jimmy, and they never seemed to get paid back. He also was really good about if somebody lost their job or was down on their luck, he would give them a job behind the bar for as long as they needed. And he also had what we called an open couch policy. So in the morning, a lot of times I would come down and there'd be some guy sacked out on the couch. Usually maybe he got into a fight with the missus or maybe he had too much to drink, and Dad would just bring him home and let him sack out. But there was one guy who was a little different, a little shadier. I actually only knew him as a voice on the phone. I never even knew his real name, so I'll just call him the guy. Every time he called, he used a different name. I only knew 3 things about him. Number one, he no longer lived in the US. By the time, my brothers and sisters actually remembered meeting him when they were younger, but by the time I came up, he was living in Europe or the UK or wherever. The second thing I knew about him was that he was super rich. He actually lived in castles. My parents would go and visit him sometimes. They would sort of tack on some extra days to their Ireland trip, and they would come home talking about how he lived in these big, beautiful castles. But the third thing was, and most importantly, he was a secret. We were not allowed to talk about him. And if I asked about him, like I'd say, "Hey, why does he have a different name every time he calls?" My dad would say, "Don't worry about it." And if I said, "Well, how does he get to live in castles?" Mom would say, "Ooh, don't repeat that." So I kind of forgot about it. After my mother died, we got an email from the Coroner's Investigation Unit in Vancouver, British Columbia. That's in Canada. For those of you who went to Catholic school like me, neighbor to the north. And they were asking for our help. They had tracked us down, and they were asking for our help in identifying a man who they'd found deceased, natural causes, in his apartment, and they couldn't figure out who he was because it had appeared he'd been living under fraudulent aliases for 30 years. And they got to us because they found among his things my father's military ID card. Could we help? Immediately, we're on the group text. "Oh my God, it's the guy. It's got to be the guy. It's got to be the guy, right?" And we're exchanging memories, like what we remembered about him. My brother remembered he drove this very specific kind of car, which I can't remember because who cares? My one sister remembered that he had a girlfriend, and she would always wear this really pretty white dress. And we found out that she only wore that dress when she was playing tennis. Like, who wears a dress to play tennis? Like rich people, right? I don't know. And then my other sister remembered seeing a gun in his bag. Snoops, I know, we love Snoop. So I remembered that he lived in castles. So as the recording secretary of the family, I was elected to make the phone call to the investigators. And I was chatting with him, and I kind of thought to myself, I guess he's probably like a tax evader, kind of like some sleazy rich guy. I was unprepared to hear that he was actually an international jewel thief, a grifter, a long con artist. And he had been for at least the 30 years that he'd been living in Canada. I was like, oh my God, why do my parents know this guy? It sort of hoping it wasn't the guy, hoping it was like a different guy. So I'm listening to the investigator, and I'm not revealing that we suspect that it might be our guy, partially because, I didn't know. I mean, who knows if it's the guy or not? It was totally the guy. Totally. But also because he was a secret. We weren't supposed to talk about it. So the investigator asks me if I wouldn't mind taking some photographs that they'd found in the guy's belongings of IDs from him from over the years and showing it around to my family to see if maybe anybody recognized him. And of course, right away, everyone's, it's the guy. For sure, it's the guy. And my siblings even remembered his real name. So I immediately get on the horn to the aunts and uncles, because I'm like, they got to know the situation here. And every single one of them, I call and I'd say, remember the guy? They'd say, who wants to know? The guy was an old army buddy of my dad's. And that's when I remembered. When I was little, I'd ask my dad, why don't you have any army stuff? Like, where are your medals and where's your hat? All my friends' dads had their stuff around. My dad never had any of that stuff. And he said, oh, yeah, well, I hated being in the army. So me and my buddy, the guy, when we got discharged from Fort Hood, Texas, we drove across country. And every time we hit a state line, we would throw a piece of our uniform out the window. So by the time they reached Pennsylvania, they were a little low on uniform, I guess. And they started throwing like their dog tags and their discharge papers and their ID cards. So I think maybe that's when he got it? Did he steal it? Did my dad think he threw out the window, but really this guy took it? And even so, why had he kept it for such a long time? That was 1954. So I call the investigator back. He literally woo-hoos. I mean, like, probably the most emotion that a Canadian has ever expressed. Because they've been trying to close this case for years. They have not been able to figure this guy out. And I give him the name that my siblings told me, and I tell him a little bit about the fact that he was an army buddy. And I don't go too much further than that, because, we don't know if my parents could be implicated. Worried about them getting arrested from the grave, I guess. I don't know. So we don't really say much, but the investigator takes that and goes back away with it. And he actually comes back a couple of months later. They actually returned the ID card to us, so I have it. And they also gave us a little bit more information. They told us, yeah, we tracked him down. Sure enough, your guy is our guy, same guy. And not only that, but he had a family. He had a wife and a son that he'd abandoned when he left the US to move over to Europe. And he'd never used my dad's identity. So they couldn't tell us actually why he'd kept it all those years. So I like to think that maybe this was just one of those guys that my dad, open couch policy, and who lived in the gray. I hope so.